Chapter 3 is about the history and growth of sport communication. This chapter looks at how sport communication has evolved and grown over time. It explores how technology and culture changes have influenced the growth of sport over the past centuries. It's important to study the history of sport communication to see how it has evolved and to see how it may continue to develop in our society and in other societies. Individuals have participated in sports since the beginning of time. Early on, activities focused on recreation and leisure. Leisure activities included fishing, hunting, swimming, skating, and wrestling. There was limited media coverage. As the 19th century progressed, daily and weekly newspapers began appearing in the United States, and they were dedicated to leisure life. As technology advanced and literacy rates increased, more and more newspapers were sold. When newspapers were reporting on sport, it was typically about horse racing, boxing, and wrestling. The first front page coverage of sport was in the 1840s, and it was about racing and boxing. With the advent of the telegraph in 1844, sport news featured instantaneous reports of games, horse races, boxing bouts, and other events. Sports popularity developed further after the Civil War, which was propelled especially by the popularity of baseball. The game entertained the Union and Confederate armies and bypassed class and geographic lines after the war ended. Baseball clubs expanded in the 1870s, and the National League was formed in 1876. As baseball became more popular, sport became a daily feature in the larger newspapers in the 1870s. The press started to realize the importance of recurrent and innovative sport reporting. By the 1880s, sport pages were covering football, boxing, baseball, horse racing, cricket, yacht racing, homing pigeon racing, baseball racing, and lacrosse. Along the way, the growth of sports journalism was also propelled by the development of the web printing press, improvements in the typewriter, and the invention of the telephone. The steam engine drove the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century Britain, and by the mid-19th century, it reached the U.S. Because of this, American life became more industrial, urban, and modern. By the 20th century, journalists and writers were attending to the mode of the life marked by transition in the midst of the modern advancements and individual problems. This type of journalism and reporting was referred to by the terms new journalism and muckraking. New journalism was looking for social reform. Muckraking was a way for journalists to expose established institutions and leaders as corrupt. There were only a few sport periodicals in existence. Their stories were brief and only offered readers the bare minimum of information about the games and athletes. Trade papers stuck to presenting facts, included photographs of athletes and sports people. As sport coverage continued to describe events, more people wanted to participate in them. Throughout history, sport has reflected cultural values, and this is especially true in the early 20th century. At this time, most individuals were seeking escape from post-war struggles. The golden age of sport was an appropriate title for this decade because it was a time when athletes, coaches, and sport writers all gained iconic status. Household names included athletes like Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Bill Tilden, and writers like Grantland Rice, Ring Lardner, and Damon Runyon. During sports' golden age, the most magnificent athletes prompted sports journalists to use vivid, descriptive, and imaginative language. The amount of space devoted to sport coverage had expanded from less than 2% of total news space in 1875 to more than 20% in 1927. The narratives produced by Golden Age sport writers sparked interest in sport overall, and in particular athletes, even as they helped restore and energize Americans in a new era that preceded the commercialization of sport and TV. These writers engaged readers in their stories and offered renewed hope in the American dream and in the sport hero. Key characteristics of the Golden Age are sporting events made front-page headlines, writers embellished prose with metaphors, analogies, and other literary devices. Top athletes became the subject of hero worship. Writers used emotional and gripping language with vivid imagery. And there was meticulous detail that was used to describe events and define sport and cultural agendas. In the perspective period of 1930 to 1950, the giddiness and devil-may-care attitude of the U.S. changed dramatically during the Depression and World War II. Radio development as a medium made a difference also. Some people started viewing sport writing as a trivial and sometimes crooked occupation. Readers questioned the professionalism, objectivity, and ethics of sports writers. Readers also questioned the relationship between the journalists, promoters, and owners. The Great Depression drastically affected newspaper revenues and writer salaries, but sports team owners paid for writers' expenses on the road in return for positive publicity. So people would question if they were actually writing true stories or if they were just getting kickbacks and would write it based on what they were getting paid. Another trend during this period was that newspaper organizations reorganized in a way that sport departments began to edit their own copy and freed them from their paper's general editorial structures. The third trend in the perspective period was a shift in popularity from college to professional sports. During the Golden Age, newspapers covered baseball, boxing, and horse racing. Now coverage branched out to include football and basketball. The fourth trend during this period was the development of radio as a medium. Radio led to an increased realism and objectivity in reporting, as well as the flair for verbal commentary. All of these trends influenced sport coverage, but the greatest influence on the sports writers during the 1930s involved a shift in people's attitudes. The 1936 Olympic Games brought a transformation of political proportions. This resulted in simpler and more serious writing. When the market crashed in 1929, at newspapers, advertising revenues fell, leading to decreases in stories, narrow columns, and larger fonts. Tabloid formats and pictures took the forefront. In this era, sport and good sport behavior gained prominence. By 1938, some city newspapers devoted as much as 38% of their space to pictures. The 1940s saw the emergence of specialized magazines like World Tennis, Golf Digest, and Daily Racing Form as the market for niche writing took shape. Throughout history, the media have both reported on and sometimes reflected friction between mainstream culture and diverse subcultures in the United States. By 1900, nearly 200 African American newspapers were being published in the United States, and these papers offered diverse viewpoints and published articles on causes. After World War I, the black press redoubled its efforts as a crusader, and circulation grew to more than 1 million copies per week as it fought for racial integration, equality, and national black consciousness. The transition years are the time frame from 1950 to 1970. During this time, a new medium enabled fans to experience sport instantly and visually. Nearly 100 TV stations operated in the United States. People had money in their pockets to spend. So there were more TVs in people's homes at this time. During the transition years, print journalists modified both the style and content of their offerings to compete with sport coverage. And this was provided by a new medium, which was television. TV brought live events to fans and visually captured key moments in plays. Boxing was broadcast throughout the 1950s, and increasing attention was also given to basketball, bowling, and baseball. In the transition years, women started entering the field of sports journalism. In 1954, Sports Illustrated was created. It made sport more legitimate with its sophisticated and colorful journalism, captivating readers and influencing the skyrocketing growth of sport in the 1950s and 60s. The advent of a new TV medium, coupled with the specific technology advances in televised sport coverage, influenced sports development as a part of the social fabric in the United States and beyond. Two men were crucial to the development of both sport and TV. Former NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle and former ABC President Roone Ulrich. They helped shape how sports were covered. Think about the Super Bowl. It's one of the most viewed TV programs, let alone the most viewed sport program. In the transition years, sport was influenced by network TV. In the late 1970s and 80s, cable TV expanded the reach of sport coverage. ESPN was created. It was first broadcast on September 7th, 1979. ESPN is a 24-hour sport channel, so people can get their sports whatever time they want. During this information age, sports focus has shifted to a spectator-centered technology and business. The information age began in the 1990s and merged into the digital age as technology and media increasingly influence interactions, communication experiences, and global perspectives. People get their information in all different ways. Sport organizations need to keep up with technology changes to stay on top of the needs of their consumers. Continuity and change are part and parcel of the digital age, which is characterized by rapid transmissions of the information across multiple platforms, synergy between discrete media entities, and the resulting effects of new values and elite sports reliance on the media. Changes in technology have a lot of upsides with different ways to measure data and share information with a lot of people across different platforms at all times. So that is a brief history about sport communication, how it came about, and how it is evolving over time. So we're going to move on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about sport communication and the strategic sport communication model. As we just saw in Chapter 3 with our look at the historical aspects of sport communication, we note how much it has evolved over the past several decades. That growth has made a significant impact on global society. Sport organizations are making changes to how they report their information, so it makes it easier for consumers to get their information the way that they want it. Global sport media is a highly visible and major component of sport communication. Some individuals have a very narrow view of sport communication and deal with sport journalism only. But practitioners and scholars are increasingly endorsing a broader perspective of this discipline. In reality, sport communication is everywhere. Expanding the view in this field requires segmentation and a framework. This framework is called the Strategic Sport Communication Model, or SSCM. It encompasses the field of sport communication and its unique components. Studying sport communication involves more than just looking at messages that are sport-related. At its basic level, sport communication could be defined as the exchange of information by or through sport. But that limits what is actually involved. Instead, experts prefer the definition of sport communication is a process by which people in sport, in a sport setting, or through sport, a sport endeavor, share symbols as they create meaning through interaction. This figure represents the definitional components of sport communication, and it shows that it's a continual process. Before we get into the actual strategic sport communication model, let's talk about how it was developed. The SSCM is built on numerous theories and models of communication, media, and information that have been proposed across various disciplines over the years. To embrace as many theories and models as possible, the broad approach of the SSCM is based on research into genres, context, and process of communication. The genres of communication are addressed by theories that come in various shapes and sizes. Structural theories focus on languages and social systems. Functional theories focus on how organized systems function. Cognitive and behavioral theories focus on individuals. Interactional and conventional theories focus on the process and effects of interaction. Interpretive theories focus on the discovery of meaning in actions and text. Critical theories focus on specific issues such as domination, inequality, and oppression. Regardless of the theoretical approach, communication involves context. It is impossible to analyze sport communication without examining context or levels of communication, like interpersonal, group, or organizational. SSCM has three different components. Component 1 includes intrapersonal, interpersonal, small group, and intraorganizational communication. Component 2 includes mediated sport communication. And component 3 includes sport communication services and support. Sport communication is a dynamic process that includes active, interactive, and reactive processes involving institutions, text, and audiences. Early communication models involve the following elements: a source who encoded the message, a message or signal that is transmitted either through interpersonal communication or through another channel, and a destination where the receiver decodes the message or signal. This model did not take into account noise, which can be a huge factor in communication transmission. And this figure shows that how the process has been updated. It is made up of many components. Even though sport communication can be difficult at times because of the noise or even poor listening skills of the receiver, the process itself is pretty simple. As I mentioned earlier, sport communication is a process by which people in the sport setting or through a sport endeavor share symbols as they create meaning through interaction within the communication process. Receivers of the message can choose to accept or reject the message. They can also decode it if they want to share that message or keep it to themselves. Communication involving sport mass media may have effects such as increased ratings, fan support, and purchases of merchandise. There are certain people known as the gatekeepers for sport communication. They were editors who selected news stories for newspapers, but now with all the social media presence and the way that everybody gets information, we can all be gatekeepers. We can decide if we want to perpetuate stories and keep them in the public view, if we want to share those stories or not. Sport communication, all communication actually, requires a sender and a receiver. They can be individuals, they can be small groups, it could be mass medias, they could be bystanders, or any other type of sport communication participants. Typically, the sender for sport communication would be the authors, the editors, and reporters. The receiver would be the listeners, the fans, and the sponsors. The medium through which an instance of sport communications takes place is known as the communication channel. This can happen anywhere. Sport communication in sport would be when a coach is talking to his or her team about the next play or giving them motivational pep talk at halftime. Sport communication through sport is when an athlete is paid to do an endorsement of a product. Sport communication in a sports setting is when a team president gets together to talk about a trade possibility. Sharing symbols is the transmission of messages in and through sport. These messages can be posts, tweets, sports columns, signs, sport programs, text, images, sounds, advertisements, or really any other shared symbols that are communicated. A symbol in a sport organization might be as simple as a story passed along through the years. Stories about events, histories, or myths can help the sport organization create, sustain, or reinforce its image. It's also a common practice in the sport industry to create symbolism and reinforce culture through the use of specialized language. If you think about Nike's Just Do It slogan, it communicates identity and reinforces their perception and their value. In order for sport communication to create meanings, there must be action and interaction between communicators and recipients. One central element of this relationship is language, which involves a system of verbalization and gestures used in the community to facilitate communication. Language is ambiguous and varies across cultures, yet individuals still seek to create meaning through the communication process amidst their varied experiences. In the process of sport communication, meaning is created through the actions, interactions, and reactions of the participants. The SSCM illustrates the uniqueness of sport communication. It explains the relationship between the key variables in sport communication. The model's framework bridges theory and practice by combining the process of sport communication and the main elements of the field. The SSCM is broken down into three components. Component 1 is personal and organizational communication in sport. These are the foundational and critical areas in sport communication. Component 2 is mediated communication in sport, and this includes the most readily apparent segments of sport communication. Mediated sport communication is conducted through countless mass media and social media endeavors. And the third component is sport communication services and support. Segments in this component include sport-related integrated marketing communication, public relations and crisis communication, and communication research. This is a critical component. Marketing your product in the sea of other products is a huge undertaking and requires a lot of skill. Also, being able to avoid crisis or spin a story when a crisis occurs and doing damage control is also really important for the future of your athlete, your organization, and your brand. So, sport communication services and support should not be an afterthought. Public relations is very important, very critical to your organization as a whole. So those are the components of SSCM. Brief overview of Chapter 4. So we've done Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. If you have any questions about these chapters, please feel free to reach out to me. As always, I am here to help.